Mephibosheth, the crippled son of Jonathan and grandson of King Saul, lived far from the noise of palaces and power. Hidden in a forgotten land, he grew up believing his story had already ended before it truly began. Once born into royalty, he now walked with weakness, carrying not only a physical injury but the heavy weight of a fallen dynasty. The house of Saul had collapsed, its name erased from the throne, and Mephibosheth survived only as a quiet remnant of a past most people wanted to forget. In those days, survival often depended on silence. To be noticed was dangerous. To be remembered could mean death. So Mephibosheth remained in obscurity, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, and trusting no one. He had learned that power rarely shows mercy, especially to the descendants of a former king. Every knock at the door could be a threat. Every mention of David's name stirred fear, not hope. But history was about to take an unexpected turn. Unbeknownst to him, King David, now firmly established on the throne, was not thinking about enemies or rivals. His heart was drawn instead to an old covenant, a promise made long ago to Jonathan, a promise rooted in loyalty, friendship, and honor. What David was about to do would challenge every expectation Mephibosheth had about kingship, mercy, and worth. This is not just a story about ancient royalty. It is a story about betrayal hiding behind loyalty, about truth buried beneath lies, and about how integrity is revealed when power shifts. Before we uncover the shocking actions of Ziba and the quiet faithfulness of Mephibosheth, take a moment to support the channel. If stories of truth, character, and timeless lessons matter to you, like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Now, step with us into a moment where kindness confronts deception and where a forgotten man is called into the presence of a king. When Mephibosheth was finally brought into David's presence, the weight of history pressed heavily upon him. Each step toward the throne felt like a journey into judgment, not mercy. He bowed low, expecting to be treated as a remnant of a fallen enemy, a fragile reminder of a dynasty long erased. Yet David's voice did not carry suspicion or threat. Instead, it carried the steady tone of a king who remembered a promise and intended to keep it. In that moment, fear gave way to astonishment as David spoke words that reshaped Mephibosheth's entire existence. Rather than stripping him of what little dignity he had left, David did the unthinkable. He restored to Mephibosheth all the land that had once belonged to Saul, his grandfather, land that had been lost to war, time, and political collapse. Fields once silent were returned to their rightful heir, not because Mephibosheth demanded them, but because grace demanded justice. Even more striking, David invited him to eat continually at the royal table, a privilege reserved for the king's own sons. For a man who had lived hidden in exile, accustomed to surviving on the margins, this was more than generosity. It was a public declaration of belonging. To sit at the king's table was to be seen, protected, and honored. It meant safety in a world where lineage often determined fate. Mephibosheth, once overlooked and forgotten, was now seated among warriors, princes, and counselors, his weakness no longer defining his worth. His place was not earned by strength or ambition, but secured by covenant faithfulness, a reminder that promises made in truth can echo across generations. Yet this restoration did not happen in isolation. Standing nearby was Ziba, the servant who had managed Saul's estate since the fall of the former king's house. For years, Ziba had lived with authority over lands that were not truly his, enjoying influence that came quietly and without challenge. David's decree shifted everything. Ziba was commanded to serve Mephibosheth, to cultivate the land with his sons and servants, and to ensure that its produce supported the rightful heir. Outwardly, it was a clear structure of order and justice. Inwardly, it stirred something far more dangerous. What appeared to be a simple act of administration was, in truth, a transfer of power. Ziba was no longer the silent master behind Saul's former wealth. He was now accountable to a man the world saw as weak, a man who could not walk unaided, a man who had spent years far from influence. Though Ziba bowed and accepted the command, obedience masked a growing resentment. The authority he once held without question was now subject to the mercy of another, and that mercy had come not through Ziba, but through David. For Mephibosheth. Tautant, the days that followed were marked by quiet transformation. Each meal at the king's table reinforced a truth he had never dared to believe, that he was not a burden, not a forgotten casualty of history, but a valued son under royal protection. Yet beneath this restored order, tension quietly formed. Grace had elevated one man, but it had also exposed the ambition of another. What David intended as kindness would soon become the very stage upon which loyalty and deception would be tested, proving that not every servant who bows does so with a faithful heart. Outwardly, Ziba adjusted himself to the new order with practiced ease. He bowed when Mephibosheth passed, carried out his duties with precision, and spoke only words that sounded loyal and respectful. To anyone watching, he appeared to be the model servant, faithfully executing the king's command and ensuring that Saul's former lands continued to prosper. The fields were tilled, the harvests gathered, and the household ran smoothly. Yet beneath this surface of obedience, something far more restless was taking shape. Ziba had tasted authority for too long to forget its flavor. For years, he had stood unchallenged over Saul's estate, directing servants. Supplantus, controlling resources. Kursamavd, and enjoying influence that came without scrutiny. The land answered to him, not because it belonged to him by right, but because no rightful heir stood in his way. That quiet dominance had slowly reshaped his sense of identity. What began as responsibility had hardened into entitlement, and entitlement had grown into the belief that power, once held, should never be surrendered. Now, every command he carried out for Mephibosheth felt like a reminder of what he had lost. Each harvest delivered to the rightful heir, each order obeyed, deepened the silent wound in his pride. The man he now served was not a warrior, not a strategist, not a ruler in the eyes of the world. Mephibosheth was gentle, reserved, and physically limited, his authority resting entirely on the word of King David. To Ziba, this felt like an injustice that no decree could justify. As time passed, resentment settled into patience. Ziba understood something crucial about power. It rarely remains stable forever. Kingdoms rise and fall, alliances shift, and even the strongest thrones tremble when unrest begins. He watched the court carefully, listening more than he spoke, observing the moods of soldiers, officials, and servants alike. He learned when to be silent and when to appear useful, storing away knowledge like a merchant storing grain for a famine. In moments alone, his thoughts turned increasingly toward opportunity. He told himself that he was more capable than the man he served, more experienced. Certentus, more prepared to manage what Saul's house had once possessed. The idea took root slowly, feeding on every slight, every reminder that authority had been taken from his hands. He did not plan recklessly, nor did he act in haste. Ziba waited, convinced that the right moment would come, when loyalty would be rewarded not with humility, but with advantage. What made his resentment dangerous was not anger, but calculation. He understood the value of timing, the power of appearances, and the influence of well-placed words. He knew that kings, even righteous ones, are vulnerable in moments of crisis, when fear clouds judgment and trust becomes fragile. Ziba did not need force to reclaim what he desired. All he needed was confusion, a fractured moment when truth could be bent without immediate consequence. Meanwhile, Mephibosheth remained unaware of the quiet storm forming around him. His focus stayed fixed on gratitude rather than suspicion, on presence rather than possessions. He had no interest in reclaiming power or reshaping the past. To him, Sitting at David's table was honor enough, a grace that outweighed fields and vineyards. This difference in desire only widened the distance between the servant and the one he served, creating a contrast that would soon matter far more than either man realized. As the kingdom enjoyed a season of stability, Ziba's patience hardened into resolve. He believed the world favored those willing to seize the moment rather than wait for justice to unfold. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, unseen forces were already beginning to move, setting the stage for a crisis that would test every hidden motive. When that moment arrived, Ziba would be ready, armed not with weapons, but with deception carefully preserved for the exact instant it could change everything. The moment Ziba had been waiting for arrived not with ceremony, but with chaos. Absalom's rebellion tore through the kingdom like a sudden storm, shattering the sense of security that had settled over David's reign. Loyalty fractured, whispers turned into alliances, and the city that once echoed with confidence now trembled with uncertainty. David, forced to flee Jerusalem, left behind the throne he had built with years of sacrifice and faith. Power, once solid, was suddenly fragile, and in that fragile space, Ziba saw his opening. As the king and his followers moved through the wilderness, burdened by exhaustion and grief, Ziba appeared at precisely the right moment. He arrived not as a threat, but as a solution, bringing supplies carefully chosen to meet the king's immediate needs. The gesture spoke louder than words. In a time when many deserted David, Ziba presented himself as loyal, prepared, and generous. His posture was humble, his timing flawless, and his presence reassuring. To a weary king surrounded by uncertainty, Ziba looked like one of the few who had remained faithful. David's eyes, heavy with loss and concern for the kingdom, turned toward him with cautious gratitude. Yet one question lingered, unspoken but unavoidable. Where was Mephibosheth? The man David had honored, restored, and welcomed as family was nowhere to be seen. In a season when loyalty mattered most, absence itself felt like an answer. When David finally asked, Ziba did not hesitate. His reply came smoothly, shaped with intent rather than truth. He claimed that Mephibosheth had remained behind in Jerusalem, waiting for the chaos to deliver what he could never seize by force. According to Ziba, the crippled heir believed that the rebellion would restore Saul's kingdom to him, that the collapse of David's rule would reopen the path to power. The accusation struck deep. It transformed Mephibosheth from a recipient of mercy into a silent conspirator, from a symbol of grace into a figure of ambition hiding behind weakness. In the confusion of flight, David had no opportunity to investigate, no witnesses to question, no time to reflect on past faithfulness. He was a king under pressure, stripped of comfort, facing betrayal from within his own household. Ziba's words aligned too neatly with the fear already pressing upon him, and fear has a way of dulling discernment. The lie did not sound outrageous. It sounded possible, and in moments of crisis, possibility can outweigh truth. Ziba watched carefully as the accusation took hold. He did not press further or embellish his claim. He allowed silence to do its work, trusting that doubt once planted would grow on its own. The contrast was complete. One servant stood present, helpful, and visible. The other remained unseen, unable to defend himself. In that imbalance, perception overtook reality. David's response was swift and decisive, without malice, but without investigation. He transferred everything that belonged to Mephibosheth into Ziba's hands: the lands, the authority, the wealth that had once been restored through mercy were now reassigned through suspicion. For Ziba, the moment felt like vindication. What patience and obedience could not achieve, deception had delivered in a single exchange. He bowed deeply, masking triumph behind reverence, while the king moved on, unaware of the injustice unfolding behind him. Yet beneath Ziba's victory lay a fragile foundation. His gain rested entirely on a lie spoken in a moment of fear, and fear does not last forever. The rebellion that created the opportunity would not define the final outcome. Truth, though delayed, has a way of resurfacing, and the silence of Mephibosheth was not the silence of guilt, but the silence of powerlessness. As David continued his journey, carrying both sorrow and responsibility, the consequences of that moment followed quietly behind him. Ziba walked away enriched. Mephibosheth remained condemned without a voice, and the kingdom moved forward under a shadow that only time would expose. What seemed like a decisive judgment was, in reality, a pause before revelation, a reminder that when deception speaks first, justice often arrives later, but never without purpose. David did not make his decision from a place of calm authority, but from the strain of a king pushed to the edge. The road away from Jerusalem was heavy with loss, every step marked by uncertainty and grief. Betrayal had already cut him deeply, not from enemies, but from within his own household. In such moments, trust becomes fragile, and judgment is shaped as much by exhaustion as by reason. When Ziba's accusation reached his ears, it fell upon a heart already burdened by too many wounds to carefully untangle truth from appearance. The image Ziba painted required no great imagination. A descendant of Saul, left behind in the capital while the king fled, hoping that chaos would restore what history had taken away. It sounded plausible enough to settle into David's thoughts, especially when paired with Mephibosheth's absence. The man who had once eaten daily at the king's table was nowhere to be found. Silence, in that moment, felt louder than any defense. David did not hear the voice of loyalty, only the echo of potential betrayal. Pressed by urgency and the responsibility of protecting those still with him, David acted quickly. There was no counsel gathered, no inquiry made, no messenger sent to confirm the claim. The wilderness was no place for investigation, and the king's focus was survival, not deliberation. Versum. With a few words, spoken more in sorrow than anger, he transferred Mephibosheth's property to Ziba. The lands that had once been restored by grace were now reassigned by suspicion, and the decision carried a weight far greater than David realized at the time. For Ziba, the moment was everything he had prepared for. Years of restrained resentment culminated in a single exchange, and he received what he had long desired without lifting a hand against his master. His response was carefully measured, filled with humility and gratitude, yet empty of truth. He bowed low, presenting himself as a servant favored by circumstance rather than a man enriched by deception. To David, it was a practical solution in a season of crisis. To Ziba, it was triumph disguised as obedience. Yet beneath the surface of that decision, something unsettled lingered. David had always been known as a king who sought justice, who listened before acting, who weighed the heart as much as the facts. This moment stood in contrast to that legacy. It revealed how even wisdom can falter when pressed by fear, and how quickly the absence of one voice can distort the entire story. Mephibosheth, unable to defend himself, became a casualty not of rebellion, but of assumption. As the king moved forward, the transfer of property faded into the background of greater dangers. Armies gathered, loyalties shifted, and the fate of the kingdom hung in the balance. Yet decisions made in haste do not disappear simply because larger battles demand attention. They wait, quietly, for the moment when peace returns and unresolved truths demand to be addressed. What had been granted without investigation would eventually call for reckoning. In granting Mephibosheth's property to Ziba, David did not intend injustice. His action was shaped by circumstance, not cruelty, but good intentions cannot undo the consequences of unchecked accusations. The moment served as a reminder that leadership, no matter how righteous, remains vulnerable to manipulation when clarity is clouded by crisis. Trust, once shaken, can lead even the most faithful to act against their own values. The land changed hands, power shifted, and Ziba walked away emboldened. But the story did not end there. Truth has patience, and time often reveals what fear conceals. David's decision, born of necessity rather than certainty, would soon be revisited, and when it was, the contrast between loyalty and deception would stand unmistakably clear. In the quiet space between accusation and restoration, the true cost of believing a lie would finally come into view. When the rebellion finally collapsed and David returned to Jerusalem, the noise of war faded, but unanswered questions remained. Among those who came to meet the king was a figure few expected to see. Mephibosheth stepped forward, and before a single word was spoken, his appearance told a story that accusation never could. His clothes were worn, his beard untrimmed, his feet unwashed from the day David fled. These were not the marks of a man who had celebrated the king's downfall, but of one who had mourned it in silence. David noticed immediately. The contrast between what he had been told and what he now saw stirred doubt in his heart. When he asked why Mephibosheth had not gone with him, the answer came without bitterness or self-defense. Mephibosheth spoke simply, explaining how he had been betrayed by the very servant entrusted to help him, how he had been left behind without the means to follow the king he loved. There was no anger in his voice, only humility and gratitude for mercy already given. He reminded David that he deserved nothing, yet had been given a place at the king's table, and that whatever judgment the king chose would be accepted without protest. In that moment, the truth stood exposed without force or accusation. Ziba's carefully crafted lie unraveled in the presence of quiet faithfulness. David, recognizing his earlier haste, chose a measured response, dividing the land between them. Yet the most revealing moment came not from the king's decision, but from Mephibosheth's reaction. He refused to argue over property or wealth. His words carried the weight of integrity when he declared that Ziba could keep everything because the king had returned safely. For him, restored relationship mattered more than restored land. That single response drew a clear line between two hearts. Ziba, who had gained through deception, stood silent. Mephibosheth, who had lost through slander, stood vindicated without demanding it. The story closed not with triumph of power, but with triumph of character. Scripture records Mephibosheth's lineage continuing, his name preserved, while Ziba fades into silence. The contrast is unmistakable. Deceit may succeed for a moment, but it leaves no lasting legacy. Faithfulness, even when misunderstood or wronged, endures. This story leaves us with a timeless lesson. Integrity does not always protect us from injustice in the moment, but it does protect what matters most in the end. Truth does not need to rush, because time itself becomes its witness. Mephibosheth never fought to clear his name, yet his loyalty spoke louder than accusation. Ziba fought to secure advantage, yet his gain dissolved into obscurity. Thank you for taking this journey through a story that still speaks with clarity today. If this message resonated with you, if it challenged or encouraged you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss future stories of truth, character, and faith. Your support helps keep these lessons alive and shared with others. Until next time, remember that while deception may shine briefly, integrity always outlasts it.